I still remember the exact moment I woke up. The gray pre-dawn light filtering through my apartment window, casting everything in that peculiar half-awake glow, where reality feels soft and uncertain. And there she was, curled up in my bed like she belonged there. Her silver hair splayed across my pillow like liquid moonlight, her pointed ears catching the faint light in ways that made my sleep-addled brain struggle to process what I was seeing. And the first thought that tore through my confusion wasn't fear or panic, but something far more dangerous: curiosity. That felt like being pulled underwater by currents I hadn't known existed. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was certain she could hear it, studying the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. The way her fingers were curled loosely around my blanket, like a child clutching a favorite toy. The faint luminescent glow of her skin, that I could only see now that the sun was beginning to paint the room in shades of gold and rose. And I wondered if this was what it felt like to wake up inside a dream you never wanted to leave. My phone read 6:47 a.m., the numbers glowing red on my nightstand, and I was suddenly very aware that I had gone to sleep alone the night before, triple checking the lock on my door because my building had been having issues with the security system. And now there was an impossibly beautiful woman in my bed, who was definitely not human, and definitely not someone I had brought home from the bar, or met at any party, or encountered in any way that would make this moment remotely explicable. I should have reached for my phone. I should have called the police or my sister or anyone who could confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. Instead, I found myself noticing the small details, the way her eyelashes cast delicate shadows on her cheeks, the subtle shift of her features as she slipped closer to consciousness, the faint scent that clung to her, that wasn't perfume, but something cleaner, like ozone after a thunderstorm, mixed with the sweetness of flowers I couldn't name, and I realized I was memorizing her face without meaning to, cataloging each detail like I was afraid I'd forget it the moment she opened her eyes. When those eyes finally opened, they were the color of amber warmed by fire, ancient and young all at once. And for a suspended moment that felt like hours compressed into seconds, we simply stared at each other, her gaze holding something I couldn't read, but couldn't look away from either. "Please don't be afraid," she said, and her voice was softer than I expected, melodic in a way that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to some deeper part of my brain. And I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as they clutched the blanket tighter, the way her shoulders hunched protectively inward, despite her attempt at composure. And I understood in that instant that she was just as frightened as I was, perhaps more. And that whatever had brought her here hadn't been a choice she made lightly. My mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. And when I finally spoke, my voice emerged as a croak that sounded nothing like me. "How did you get in here?" I asked, and even to my own ears the question sounded absurdly mundane given the circumstances, like asking someone who had just materialized in my bedroom what time it was. But she seemed to appreciate the normalcy of it, because the corners of her lips twitched towards something that might have been a smile. "The window," she said, and I felt my jaw tighten as I remembered leaving it cracked open for fresh air. The fire escape outside my third-floor apartment that I had always thought was secure, but apparently was not. And I was already mentally adding reinforce all windows to the growing list of things I would need to do if I survived this encounter. "I didn't know where else to go," she continued. And now her voice wavered more noticeably, the amber eyes glistening with something that looked dangerously close to tears. And I felt the first crack appear in my defensive walls, the beginning of an empathy I hadn't given myself permission to feel yet. "My ship crashed 3 miles from here. I'm the only one who survived. I've been walking for hours, and your apartment was the only one with a light on. And you looked." She stopped abruptly, her cheeks flushing with a luminescence that made the glow of her skin seem almost visible. And I found myself leaning forward slightly, despite my better judgment, wanting to hear the rest of her sentence, even as part of me screamed that I was being ridiculous, that I should be calling authorities or reaching for something to defend myself with. That nothing good ever came from trusting beautiful strangers who appeared in your bedroom through unlocked windows. She told me her name was Kael'thasi, though she said I could call her Kael if the full version was too difficult for human vocal cords to manage. And she told me she was a researcher from a planet so far away that the light from its sun wouldn't reach Earth for another 400 years. And she told me about her mission to study distant civilizations without making contact. A research expedition that had gone catastrophically wrong when her vessel's navigation systems malfunctioned and sent her screaming through the atmosphere like a meteor with no way to steer. "We study your transmissions," she explained, her fingers finally releasing their death grip on my blanket as she seemed to settle slightly, her posture relaxing by incremental degrees, that I tracked with the careful attention of someone defusing a bomb. "Your music, your art, your mathematics, your conflicts. We've been watching Earth for 3 of your centuries, learning your languages from your broadcasts, dreaming of a day when we might finally understand what drives your species." And there was something in the way she spoke about humanity that I hadn't expected, not condescension or clinical detachment, but genuine wonder. The kind of fascination that made her eyes light up from within like captured stars. And I found myself asking questions before I could stop myself, wanting to know what she had learned about us, what confused her, what surprised her, what made her think we were worth the risk of coming here at all. The hours that followed felt like walking through a fever dream made manifest, and I moved through them in a haze of disbelief that never quite lifted, but somehow became bearable, almost comfortable, like an ill-fitting shoe you eventually forget is there. I made coffee, and she watched me with intense curiosity, asking what the dark liquid was and why humans consumed it when it seemed to have no nutritional value. And when I offered her a cup, she held it with both hands like a precious artifact, sniffing it cautiously before taking the tiniest possible sip, and then making a face of pure, unfiltered disgust that was so unexpected and so utterly human in its reaction that I burst out laughing, the sound startling us both after the tension of the morning. "How do you drink this?" she asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in her voice. And I found myself explaining the concept of acquired tastes and caffeine dependence and morning rituals. And she listened with the rapt attention of someone recording every word for later analysis. And something about her earnestness made me want to keep talking, to tell her things I had never told anyone, to fill the silence between us with words that felt more real than anything I had said in months. She told me about her world, about the twin suns that rose over her homeland and the silver seas that sang when the tides came in, about her people, who communicated much through touch as an emotion as through speech, about the research station where she had worked for 10 of her years, studying the strange blue marble that spun in the outer reaches of their star charts. And I listened with a hunger I hadn't felt since I was a child, staying up past my bedtime to finish a particularly good book. By noon, we had moved from my bedroom to my small living room, and I found myself perched on the edge of my couch while she explored the space with the careful attention of an anthropologist discovering a new culture, picking up books and examining the spines, running her fingers over the worn fabric of my armchair, standing at my window to watch the people below moving through their Saturday routines like characters in a play she had been studying her whole life. "You have so much stuff," she observed, and there was no judgment in her voice, only observation. And I felt my cheeks warm as I looked around at the accumulated debris of my life, the stacks of unread books, the collection of succulents I kept killing and replacing, the half-finished knitting project draped over the arm of a chair, the photographs on the mantle of family members I hadn't called in weeks. On my world, we keep only what has meaning. What you call minimalism, we call necessity. And when I asked her what she would keep if she could only have a few things, she was quiet for a long moment, her amber eyes growing distant and sad. And finally she said, "The memory of my mother's voice, the first data set I ever collected on Earth." And she hesitated, her gaze flickering toward me before away again. "Something I haven't found yet, something I didn't know I was looking for." The afternoon light was beginning to slant toward evening when she suddenly stiffened, her entire body going rigid like a prey animal catching wind of a predator. And before I could ask what was wrong, she was across the room and gripping my arm with surprising strength, her nails biting into my skin, not painfully but urgently, her eyes wide and wild. "They found me," she whispered, and the fear in her voice was palpable, a living thing that filled the room and made my breath catch in my throat. "The ones who caused my ship to crash. They're close." I wanted to ask questions, wanted to demand explanations, but something in her expression silenced the words in my throat. And instead I found myself moving without thinking, pulling her toward the bedroom where I kept the emergency bag I had packed years ago for exactly the kind of situation I had never actually believed would happen. The bag with cash and copies of important documents and a flashlight and water purification tablets and all the other things survival guides told you to have, but you always assumed were for other people. For the ones who lived more exciting lives than you. We need to go, I said, and she nodded. And in that moment there was something that passed between us that felt like the beginning of a sentence. I hadn't known I was waiting to speak. We slipped out my fire escape as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violent orange and deep purple. And I led her through the back alleys of my neighborhood with the familiarity of someone who had walked these paths 1,000 times, but the urgency of someone who had never had a reason to run. She moved close to me, her shoulder brushing against mine with every other step. And I was hyper-aware of her presence in a way that made everything else, the cold air, the distant sounds of traffic, the ache in my legs from walking faster than I usually did, fade into background noise. "Where are we going?" she asked, and I told her about an old friend from college who lived an hour away and owed me a favor. Someone who wouldn't ask questions and who had a property out in the country where we could lay low. And she nodded and trusted me with an absolute faith that made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. We made it 3 blocks before the first drone appeared overhead, a silent black shape against the darkening sky that made Kael'thasi go pale and pull me into a doorway with a strength that belied her slight frame. And she pressed her finger to her lips, even though I hadn't made a sound. And we watched the drone pass overhead with our hearts pounding in synchrony, like instruments in the same orchestra. The next several hours blurred together in a nightmare of shadow and silence, of hiding in dumpsters and slipping through backyards and pressing ourselves against walls while lights swept past in the darkness. And through it all she never let go of my hand. Her grip, the only constant in a world that had become unfamiliar and frightening. At one point, when we were crouched behind a storage unit in an industrial district and the sounds of pursuit seemed to have faded to nothing, she turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't read, and said, "You could leave me. You should leave me. This isn't your fight. You don't owe me anything." And I wanted to tell her that she was right, that I should have called the authorities or handed her over or done anything other than what I was doing. But instead what came out was, "I know," and the way her eyes softened made something inside me crack open that I hadn't known was closed. "But you're scared," I continued, my voice barely above a whisper, "and you're alone." And I remember what that felt like. I wasn't there when I should have been, but I can be here now. She didn't say anything, but she leaned into me slightly, her head resting against my shoulder for just a moment. And in that frozen instant, I felt the weight of the universe pressing down on us both. The vastness of space and time, collapsing into the warmth of another body, pressed close against mine. And I understood with sudden clarity that whatever happened next, I wouldn't regret this choice. We reached my friend's property just as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern sky. And the old farmhouse sat dark and silent in the half-light, like a sentinel standing guard over fields that stretched toward a distant tree line. My friend wasn't home, she was in Europe for the month, having left the key where I'd known she would, in the hollow space behind the loose brick by the back door, and I led Kael'thasi inside with the reverence of someone entering a church, aware that we were trespassing in a sanctuary that wasn't technically ours, but felt more like home than my own apartment ever had. She collapsed onto the old couch in the living room, her exhaustion finally catching up with her in a wave that seemed to flatten her entire being. And I covered her with a blanket that smelled faintly of dust and lavender, and found myself watching her sleep with an intensity that should have felt creepy, but instead felt like the most natural thing in the world. I didn't know what would happen when the people hunting her caught up, didn't know if my friend would mind us being here, didn't know if I was making the biggest mistake of my life or the best decision I had ever made. But I knew that for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt awake, alive, present in a way that made every cell of my body tingle with awareness. She slept for hours while I kept watch, pacing the old farmhouse with a vigilance that felt both absurd and necessary, checking the windows and doors and planning escape routes I hoped we wouldn't need. When she finally woke, the afternoon sun was streaming through the windows at an angle that made her skin glow like polished bronze and her silver hair shimmer with strands of gold. And she looked at me with those ancient amber eyes, and something in her expression had shifted, softened, become something that looked dangerously like trust. "I dreamed of my mother," she said, her voice rough with sleep, and something else I couldn't name. "She told me that the universe sends you what you need when you need it, even when you don't know you need it." She paused, her gaze holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I think she was talking about you, and I wanted to tell her that I wasn't anything special. That I was just a regular person who had stumbled into something extraordinary. That she was the one who was remarkable, with her starlight skin and her ancient eyes, and her unwavering faith in a humanity she had studied from so far away. But instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of the couch beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin, close enough to see the fine points of her ears that marked her as something other, close enough to see the tiny flecks of silver in her amber eyes that I hadn't noticed before. It was then that I realized she had a unique ability. She could sense emotions, feel them as tangible things that rippled through the air around her like heat waves rising from summer pavement. And she had been doing it since we met, reading my fear and my curiosity and my growing affection without my ever knowing. And the revelation should have felt invasive, but instead felt like a gift. Like she had been showing me her truest self by letting me know how deeply she could perceive. "On my world, we don't lie," she explained, her voice soft and a little sad. "We can't. Everything we feel shows on our faces, in our voices, in the way we hold our bodies. It's why we came, to study your species. You have the most beautiful contradiction. You feel so much, and yet you hide it so well. It's like watching a symphony conducted in silence." And I thought about all the times I had pretended to be fine when I wasn't. All the smiles I had worn like masks, all the words I had swallowed because saying them felt too dangerous. And I understood suddenly why she was fascinated by us, why she had risked everything to come here. Why? She looked at me now with something that might have been wonder. "I want to show you something," she said, and before I could respond, she reached out and placed her palm against my cheek. And the sensation that flooded through me was like nothing I had ever experienced. Not telepathy exactly, but something more intimate. A sharing of pure feeling without words, and I felt her loneliness pressing against my loneliness, her fear against my fear, and underneath it all, something that felt impossibly like hope. We stayed in the farmhouse for 3 days, and in those 3 days I learned more about myself than I had in the previous 30 years of my life. I learned that I was braver than I thought, that I could make decisions under pressure without freezing, that there were limits to what I was willing to sacrifice and lines I wouldn't cross, no matter the cost. I learned that Kael'thasi was funny in a dry, unexpected way, that she made terrible jokes about Earth customs and my coffee drinking habits and my collection of succulents, that she sang to herself in a language I couldn't understand, but that sounded like wind chimes and ocean waves and memories of things I had never experienced. I learned that she was as scared of this connection between us as I was, that she had never felt anything quite like it in her entire life, that her people loved deeply but rarely, and that she was terrified of what would happen when she had to leave. "I can't stay," she said on the 3rd night, when we were sitting on the farmhouse porch watching the stars wheel overhead in patterns I had never noticed before, patterns she could navigate like a map of her own backyard. "I have to go back. I have to report what happened, warn my people about the ones who attacked me, finish the mission I was sent here to accomplish." And I knew, had always known, that this was coming, that she was a visitor who would eventually return to her own world. But hearing her say it out loud made something inside me crumble like sand through fingers. "Then go," I said, and my voice cracked on the words, but I forced them out anyway, because I understood, finally, what she had been trying to tell me about her people. About not lying, about showing everything you feel. Finish your mission. Come back when you can. She looked at me with an expression that shattered and reformed something in my chest, and she said, "Wait for me." And the question was so small, so vulnerable, so utterly not the words of an ancient alien researcher from a distant world, that I felt my heart stutter in my chest. "How long?" I asked, because I had to know, had to understand, what I was agreeing to, and she was quiet for a long moment before she answered. 7 of your years, maybe 8. It takes time to prepare a ship for the journey, to get clearance too. She trailed off, her luminous cheeks flushing with that telltale glow I had come to recognize as embarrassment, to say goodbye properly. And I thought about 7 years, about how much could change in that time, about how I would be older, different, maybe someone she wouldn't recognize. But I thought also about how much I had changed in just 3 days. How the person who had woken up alone in his apartment on Saturday morning was not the same person sitting on this porch now. And I understood that some things were worth waiting for, worth the risk of change, worth the terrifying vulnerability of hoping. The ship she had hidden in the woods behind the farmhouse was small and silver and looked like nothing so much as a teardrop frozen in mid-fall. And I helped her carry the supplies she needed for the journey back, my hands lingering on hers every time we touched, memorizing the warmth of her skin and the strength of her grip. At the entrance to the ship, she turned to face me one last time, and the amber eyes that had first met mine in the gray pre-dawn light 4 days ago were bright with tears that fell like liquid light down her luminescent cheeks. And I reached out to brush one away with my thumb, marveling at the way it shimmered against my skin. "I'll come back," she said, and it wasn't a promise, but a determination, a fact as certain as the rising of her twin suns. I found what I was looking for, and before I could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to mine, a gesture I didn't understand, but that felt like a vow, like a seal on something that had been forming between us since the moment she opened her eyes in my bed and asked me not to be afraid. 7 years, she whispered. Keep living, keep growing, and when I return, tell me everything. And then she was gone, stepping into the ship that whooshed, closed behind her like a breath, held and released. And the sky above the farmhouse filled with light as she rose toward the stars that had been her home for so long. And I stood in the field watching her disappear until she was nothing but a brighter star among thousands, a new constellation that only I would recognize. I drove back to my apartment as the sun rose over a world that looked the same and felt entirely different, and when I walked through my door, the bedroom was empty and quiet, and looked exactly as it had before that morning, except for the lingering scent of ozone and flowers that I knew would fade eventually, but that I refused to wash from my sheets. I lay down on the bed where she had first appeared to me like a gift I hadn't known I wanted, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about 7 years, about all the things that could happen in that time, about who I would become and who she would be when she returned. And then I smiled, really smiled, for the first time in longer than I could remember, because I understood something that I hadn't understood before. Some stories don't end when the protagonist leaves. Some stories pause, holding their breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin. And some stories are worth waiting for, worth the uncertainty and the fear and the ache of missing someone you barely know but already can't imagine living without. I closed my eyes and let the memory of her face wash over me. The silver hair and pointed ears and amber eyes that had looked at me with wonder and trust and something that felt impossibly like love. And I whispered to the empty room, to the universe, to whatever force had sent her crashing into my life, "I'll be here." And somewhere out among the stars, light years away and 7 years distant, I knew she heard me.